Yay! Hello, everybody. Welcome back to day 3 of Brainhack Global Ontario, and welcome back. Oh wait, to this session. Wait, I want to call. Oh no, I can't. Never mind. Sorry. And I really want to thank everyone who's here today. I think we have a very special and important morning for ourselves. So today is our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusivity panel. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you guys of a few things. I wanted to start by reminding us of the ground that we're sitting on today. Well, the ground that we academically are sitting on, and to think about the way that we are positioned in the lands today. So the University of Western Ontario acknowledges that the campus is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenawapawak, and the Attawandaron peoples, and that the lands connected with London Township and the Soma Treaties of 1796 and the Dish of the Spoon Covenant Wampum. CAMH is situated on lands that have been occupied by First Nations for millennia. These lands are rich in civilizations with knowledge of medicine, architecture, technology, and extensive trade routes throughout the Americas. The site that CAMH appears on in the colonial records as the council grounds of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And Toronto is home for a vast diversity of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who enrich this city. And it's especially important today to think about how all of our institutions and all of us as a Canadian people need to acknowledge and work towards the path of reconciliation with the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people of Canada. So I want to take a moment to thank, I'm sorry for the people who left off this slide, but thank the amazing volunteers who have kept this event going throughout the last 3 days. For those of you who are joining us this morning, welcome. This panel is part of a larger event, and we're very happy that you can join us. And if you look to the top, you see the word schedule. If you click on that, you actually have the ability to watch all of the videos that are being presented during this event. You can click in between them. I hope you stay with us today because I think this is one of the most important ones. But afterwards, feel free to go back and learn more about exciting neuroimaging tools and tutorials because it's been a really great week. And I also wanted to remind you today of the Brainhack Code of Conduct before we get started. Brainhack is dedicated to providing a harassment-free Brainhack experience for everyone, regardless of gender, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, age, or religion, and we do not tolerate harassment in any form during our events. This includes harassment online and online bullying, as well as disruptive and intimidating comments within the chat. Our site administrators are very knowledgeable about how to do this. They're all aware of the Code of Conduct, and we are prepared to enforce it, either with warnings or discussion if that is warranted, or if the repeated events seem to be happening and seem to not be with a full ban from our system. So with that, I want to come back to our main event, which I'm very excited about, which is our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusivity panel. We have some amazing speakers here, and we have an amazing moderator, Suzanne Witt, who's our co-lead. I'm going to knock myself off the screen and so that we can all focus on the amazing things that they have to say and the discussion that they're going to foster. So, give me 1 second to invite people and kick myself. We're missing one panelist today. I'll find her.
I hope everyone's having a lovely morning. I'm super excited for today.
Yay! And bye, guys.
Kasey on the screen.
Bye. Thanks.
Oh wait, no.
Just a disembodied Aaron speaking. Okay, so Welcome to the EDI discussion panel. This is really meant to be a discussion panel, not just the 4 lovely panelists speaking sort of at you. We have currently about 6 questions, sort of open-ended, that we're going to try and get through. But if you have additional questions, you can type them in the chat box. And if you put a question mark at the end of it, it will actually put it into the Ask a Question box sort of at the bottom right side of your screen, and we can sort of keep an eye on that, and panelists and other people participating can also choose to answer in this text box. So I guess we'll start with having all of the panelists introduce themselves and maybe give a very brief sort of statement of sort of why you agreed to participate in this EDI panel discussion. So I guess we'll start with sort of my upper left. I don't know if they're the same order for everyone, but we'll start with Olivia.
Awesome. Yes, I appear on my upper left too. So thank you for having me here today. My name is Olivia Goswabi. I am currently a second-year PhD student at Western University studying neuroscience, and particularly looking at neuroplasticity and nutrition and ways we can boost and enhance this process of neurogenesis to reverse the effects of obesity on the brain. I'm super excited to be here. I wanted to participate in this panel to provide kind of that inside perspective that I have gone through as a Black woman in neuroscience, as well as an Indian woman in neuroscience. I am biracial. So it's an extensive process, and the work that I've been involved in has been both a learning experience and a chance to kind of share the knowledge that I've kind of gained with some of these panelists on the screen here as well, with all of you. So I really hope this can be an engaging and fruitful conversation. And in terms of my EDI experience, I am a member of the BrainsCAN EDI committee, as well as worked on a lot of the anti-racism work at Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry.
So I guess Hajer.
Hi everyone, my name is Hajer Nakua. I am a 3rd-year PhD candidate. My work primarily focuses on neuroimaging. I'm actually in Aaron's lab. So I'm really interested in brain-behavior relationships in children with neurodevelopmental disorders. Very similar to Olivia, I'm really passionate about this topic based on lived experience, but also hearing the stories of others, and really resonating with the importance of why we need to have these discussions, particularly at a peer-to-peer level, because I think that's really what this is. This is more of a discussion, as Suzanne mentioned. Over the last 1.5 years now, I've worked with the Organization of Human Brain Mapping. I'm the chair of their student postdoc committee or special interest group. And a lot of the work that we do is really centered around how do we make the experience much better for the underrepresented trainees at the OHBM meeting and conferences. And this year I am I'm a committee member on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee at OHBM. So I've been really thinking about these topics extensively to try to figure out ways that we can make neuroimaging much more of an inclusive environment. And that is why I'm really excited to be here today.
Okay, Alex.
Cool. There we go. Hi, my name is Alex. I'm a postdoc at Western, and I work on brain plasticity in hearing loss. So looking at functional and structural markers of plasticity. Alongside that, I work with, so I'm getting lots of feedback on myself. I also work on the EDI committee with Kasey and Olivia at BrainsCAN. I've also been elected to be VP EDI of the Postdoctoral Association of Western. And in terms of EDI work, I think it's crucial to have a diverse research environment to get the best science. Diversity means wider perspective, just a wider scope of thought. I've been lucky enough to live in a lot of different countries, so I also bring a lot of cultural competence, and wherever I live, I am an immigrant. So I think that it's very important to think about just how receiving an environment is and making sure that everyone is welcome and everyone is heard and everyone's individual differences are embraced rather than marginalized because they don't fit the cookie cutter of what our system has proposed. So that's me. Thanks.
Okay, and Kasey?
Hi, I'm Kasey Van Hedger. I'm a postdoc at Western. My research is primarily in the area of substance use and addictive disorders, and I'm currently working in a lab that does a lot of neuroimaging and studies striatally mediated disorders like addiction, but also obsessive compulsive disorder and Parkinson's disease. And I'm participating in this today. As Alex mentioned, I sit on the BrainsCAN EDI committee with Olivia and Alex, and we've been doing some other great work at Western with the medical school as well. And EDI is just something that's really, really important to me. I think that it's an area where there's a lot of room for improvement in academic institutions in generally, and I think that we should always be working towards trying to improve things. I recognize that, you know, being a part of this panel, I am a cisgendered white woman from an upper middle class background who has an insane amount of academic privilege. I have parents that have graduate degrees. I have all of these things. So I realize that I have a lot of identities that are very privileged in an academic space and often overprivileged in those spaces. So I think that my approach to EDI is really about trying to come into every situation and seeing what I can contribute and what I can learn, especially too, and learn from my peers. This is sort of, it's always an ongoing process. It's something that is for everyone, and that's something that everyone can get better at over time. And there are sort of more productive and less productive ways to go about that I'm sure that we can talk about further on this panel too. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm glad that you guys are all here too.
Okay, so we're gonna sort of the first three questions that we're gonna be discussing are really sort of about interpersonal relationships with your supervisor and then within the lab space. So the first one is how do you go about navigating the mentor-mentee relationship, particularly in the context where a lot of times your mentor isn't going to look like you in terms of diversity or, you know, gender or even race, ethnicity? So I think whoever, if someone just wants to unmute themselves and start talking, I don't think we're going to sort of do the middle school classroom of Olivia, what do you have to say, Hajer? So.
I mean, I'm happy to jump right into that. So I've been navigating both primarily the mentee side of things. So I'm learning a lot from my supervisor specifically, and even the postdocs on the screen here and other mentors in my life. And what I find is that communication is key. So as someone who comes from the Black community, it's very important to be, it's okay to be open about those conversations and to actually have them with your student. Of course, it's delicate, and that's why it's so important that all supervisors and potential mentors in any situation are well educated on these various topics of potential backgrounds that people come from. And that can include things like the different experiences that an individual have. And of course, you can't necessarily live through them yourself, but you can try to empathize and understand kind of a bit of that background and that history at the very least. And when we're looking at it in an academic setting, being able to engage with your mentee in a way that you're promoting their success and you're engaging them in the right ways within their community by giving them that kind of, when I think about equity, giving them that ladder that can help get them to the spot where someone that came with those same privileges, with completely different set of privileges, you can kind of get there too. And I think that's super important. And it comes with communicating with your student, hearing what their goals are, what their needs are, even just asking, what do you need to be successful can really make a difference in your mentee's success. And that's kind of giving them a chance to be proactive about their own experiences and not feeling that like they're being spoon-fed opportunities, but also at the same time, acknowledging that you're there to support them in that process. So that's just more of my, as a mentee, kind of the expectations that I have or expect from a mentor. And when we get into the mentor conversation, I'll add to that, but I want to give everyone a chance to kind of chime in there.
I really liked all the things that Olivia said. She hit the nail on the head. And it's really important to acknowledge that this is really a two-way street. And I think a lot of the work does have to be done on the mentor side because of the natural power dynamic that exists in academia. If places are not inclusive, students who come from underrepresented groups are not going to want to communicate because they don't feel like that space is safe enough to do so. So I think on the supervisor side, it is also really important to educate themselves on the situation so they know actually how to navigate any conversation about something that may make them uncomfortable only because they don't have any lived experience. Another thing that I was reading about yesterday, students who have different types of disabilities, like some students are blind or they are on wheelchairs, and what supervisors have been starting to do is just asking, what do you need to succeed? So you don't have to get into these really complicated discussions like, how do you feel about your condition? Because then it puts them in a defensive kind of like, oh, I guess it's a little bit difficult, or they may be defensive and say, I'm totally fine, but I'm just asking them, what do you need to succeed? And I think every supervisor should do that. It gives the student the space to really say like, this is how I've been treated, in schools. And I feel like my intellectual ability has never been recognized because of the color of my skin. And so I really want to make sure that in this lab to succeed, I want to, have that validation that, I'm doing well or something like that. So asking those questions where the supervisor doesn't put the burden of like, tell me your life story so I can understand, but it's more of how can I help you? Because that's the situation that we're in. And then as a mentee, like Olivia said, really, trying to push yourself to see how much you can communicate with your supervisor to share, how you're feeling or all the different steps that you feel like could get you to where you want to be.
So I'll chime in here as well. I thought that the points you brought up were absolutely awesome. And I think it comes down to basic communication, making sure that you communicate your needs and that they are met. And that, of course, like you mentioned, there is a different power dynamic here. So sometimes, calling your mentor out is not something that we're comfortable with, especially if you're part of a, marginalized group, then, you're already kind of struggling with the imbalance, and actually standing up to someone who has more influence over your path and your research and your success. But I think that, it's crucial that mentors take this on board. And I know that a lot of mentors who are forward thinking and they follow the times, whether it's with research methods or in this case, EDI is now a big topic, and they realize that this is the train that you need to be on, because there's just no other way to make things equitable and diverse and equal across everyone. So they are, I kind of thought of this in terms of how they approach research. They also approach their lab environment. So if they are good researchers, then they will realize the importance of the other aspects of a lab, and they will follow in the footsteps of all the developments happening now. But to bring it back to the mentorship relationship, I'm lucky enough to have a mentor who is a white cisgender male. So he is the predominant group that occupies the research environment. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, that he doesn't realize that he needs to support me and support the other lab members, and he needs to be aware of the different factors that come into play that he doesn't have any lived experience in, but the fact that he is willing to listen, and that I think one of the crucial parts is even identifying that everyone is different, extroverted, introverted. Maybe some people hate speaking in a group environment, so they would rather speak to him one-on-one. Every time we have a meeting, he will say, of course, you know, if you'd rather speak to me one-on-one, you can send me a message, you can come talk to me in my office. I mean, we don't have offices now, but you can talk to him on Zoom or whatever. So just making sure that everyone is comfortable and everyone knows that they can talk to him, and, you know, shame and guilt and lots of all these negative aspects of some labs are just left at the door and they're not acceptable in the lab environment.
Just to chime in on this too, I mean, I do think that there are a couple of things that this discussion is making me think of too. So one of them that I think about a fair amount actually is the idea of fit. Fit is sort of, you know, this sort of nebulous construct that people commonly use to describe why people get jobs and other people don't get jobs, or why people get accepted into labs and other people don't get accepted into labs or whatnot. And I think that it's something that within academia, we really need to move away from in some ways, because it seems like one of the things that would be a really good predictor of fit is somebody who shares experiences that you have, right? You know, you've met somebody who sort of feels like a kindred spirit before because they look like you, or they have had experiences that you've had in the past. And I worry that, you know, part of the reason, you know, that we have so many groups that are historically underrepresented within academia is because there has been this focus on fit, on this idea that, you know, we like people who are like ourselves, and if the people in power all look a certain way, then they're going to be more likely to recruit students or have mentees who also look like them. So I feel like from both perspectives, it's sort of, you know, people who are historically underrepresented don't really have a choice in terms of seeking out mentors sometimes who don't look anything like them, but that can also be sort of a positive thing because there are things that you can learn from people who are different from you in both directions in that kind of relationship. That being said too, I mean, I think that, you know, it's important for mentors to really keep that in mind also when they're thinking new students into their lab, and really kind of consider that idea that, you know, are you trying to make a point to bring in people who are different from you, for people that you might have something who are going to contribute to your lab culture, and for whom you can offer something that they might not have experienced previously. I think that the idea of lab culture too is really important, and that is sort of something that's built both by the members of the lab and by the mentor itself too. So mentors play a strong role in shaping what their culture is like, but everybody is a participant in it. So if you're in a lab that doesn't have a culture that's very good, I mean, I feel like sometimes it might be really hard, but there are things that you can try to do to change it. You know, bringing up conversations around EDI, trying to make improvements, even small ones. I feel like, you know, we as trainees can really stick up for each other in a way by doing those kinds of things, by saying, hey, you know, this is something that's important to me. Even though we're not talking about it, maybe it's important to other people as well.
Okay, so I guess Kasey did a good segue into sort of, we have two questions that are related. One is, what can you do to make your lab environment as inclusive as possible, and maybe discussing where you are in your various states of your career? Because as Kasey said, it you know, seems like this is something that even if you are a first or second year PhD student, that you still might be able to play a role in this. And then on a similar line, what are some signs that either a work environment appreciates diversity, or what are signs that you've seen that a work environment doesn't seem to appreciate diversity?
I'm just going to jump right into this because Kasey also sparked some more points that I wanted to add, just because I think, again, your lab environment is as enriched as the diversity it brings. So I find that if you have that representation across the board, the science itself is even more enhanced. You'll find that you're getting those different perspectives that are now considered in the work you do, and for the members that are interacting with each other. And I think that's so important. And to kind of bring in the role of being a lab member and even being a mentee, you are in a space, and I hope you are in a space where you're able to make comments and to provide suggestions and feedback that better enhance the community and engagement within your lab. And I think that's so important to feel that empowerment. And that's a good sign that you are in the right academic space to be both successful for yourself and to kind of instill that success in others around you, especially in the work that they're doing. And I always want to emphasize that it's okay to speak up. Like, for example, the whole Black Lives Matter movement really meant something for me, of course. And so I actually chimed in and I sent a message to the lab to bring them in the conversation to say, hey, this is going on right now. I'm here if you ever want to talk about it a bit more, especially because I am the only Black woman in my lab. So it's okay to have these conversations and to even discuss how it may have been reflected in other experiences other members of this lab may have had, because everyone comes from different backgrounds. So just those little things can really enhance your environment as a lab member and kind of promoting or encouraging others to do the same.
Just wanted to chime in. I realize we are doing the middle school. We just kind of happen to be going through that cycle, so I don't want to break it. I wanted to chime in on first the second question, actually, how do we know whether a lab environment is an inclusive and diverse place? It should be quite obvious because the lab should be quite obviously diverse. Clearly, you have people from different ethnic backgrounds or any sort of underrepresented group should be clearly visible within the lab. So I do recognize that this is still, EDI in neuroscience and in research is quite relatively new. People have, finally realized this is an important thing. It is going to take time for labs to really change how it looks visibly. But I think, it's a telltale that a supervisor talks the talk and walks the walk, that they say that I'm really passionate about EDI and I want my lab to reflect this. It's really easy to be very passionate about EDI in many ways, and I consider that very genuine, even if their lab doesn't look very diverse. But it's really when I walked into a lab and I was like, wow, this is a nice lab that everybody seems to have a voice here. And if that is not the case in a lab that you are considering, maybe it's important to think about, who does the supervisor work with? Who are their collaborators? Are they all white men, if the supervisor potentially is a white male? Are all their collaborators white male? Then maybe that's, they may want to embark on an EDI journey, but they may not be there yet, So that's the one thing I really do think it is important that, just like what Alex said, I actually really like this. If supervisors and scientists, we want to be with the times. We want to know that the latest pre-processing tool that's out there, the newest version of fMRI prep, is immediately implemented in our lab. That same rigor and that same passion to do high quality science needs to be reflected in a high quality lab inclusive environment. So that's kind of the high mark. And I think that that's the most compelling evidence. Everything else is lower levels of evidence that, we'll say, we'll give it a p equals 0.06, but not fully significant, that it's an inclusive environment. Another thing is, it's really interesting, and this is something that I've been realizing this year with the Black Lives Matter discussion that really was really large this summer, and it was really cool to see how people's reaction to this was, because a lot of people were very open about talking about underrepresented groups. And I think that this does fall into two large categories. We have the supervisors who, again, in many ways do shape the lab culture. So if they are actively recruiting people in their lab from underrepresented groups, that's going to be a really important component of an inclusive environment, because again, it shows that willingness to change. And also the students, how is your lab environment talking with each other? Are you guys open to having discussions that may make some members of the lab uncomfortable because it's not their lived experience, but do they listen to you? So bringing up those discussions, as Olivia said, is really important. And also being really, as much as you can, because it's not always easy, being really open about your own lived experience. If someone says an opinion that does not match your opinion, so if you're an underrepresented group and they say like, oh, well, people in underrepresented groups don't even like science, that's why they're not here. Being vocal about that's not the case, actually, let's look at the history. And maybe that's why this is the case. So really having your voice heard, and this will empower someone else to have their voice heard, and then that kind of contributes to a much more open communication lab environment. So you're bringing people into the discussion, and I think that's how you kind of foster a long-term and sustainable inclusivity.
That was awesome. I think you really, what do you say? You hit the middle of the target.
Hit the nail on the head, I believe, is the correct term. I used to say the wrong thing all the time, but I'm learning.
Or hit bullseye. That's the one. Yeah, so I think like you guys were saying before, visible diversity is very effective, because you walk into a room and you're just like, there is a mixture of different, ethnicities, backgrounds, cultures, religions, everything. And that in itself will already make you feel more comfortable, and like it's just an exciting environment. That's always how it made me feel. But when it comes to the environment itself, I mean, if your mentor is struggling with some EDI approaches and they're not really sure where to start, I mean, you can always inject something with a question, ask whether summer internships are paid or not, because that creates a big gap between individuals who are of higher socioeconomic status versus lower, who actually need to work to make sure that there is money coming in. So raising those issues are very good too. I know that my mentor, Blake Butler, that is one of his key goals, to make sure that any work that's done in the lab is paid, to make sure that everyone can take that opportunity on board. And then just creating that open platform for speaking, because it's much easier for you to voice your kind of EDI perspective if your mentor is encouraging it. But just like Olivia gave a perfect example of, if you're part of a lab, you have a voice in the lab. You don't need to be the mentor. You can email your lab mates and say, hey, let's chat about this. If you ever have lab lunches or lab Zoom hangouts or something similar, or even a chat on Slack where you send each other encouraging and positive messages when it comes to EDI, which we do with Olivia and Kasey sometimes, that can go a long way too, just to kind of keep the topics going. I did write some things down. Another key aspect, I think, is to encourage your mentor to take feedback from the lab. So I know that, a lot of labs are implementing this, where it's a Google form, or however else you want to collect your responses, where everyone can have a platform to respond and say how they feel in the lab, what could be improved, what, is working pretty well. And that way, if your mentor's dedicated to progress and to improving EDI in the lab, then they can take that on board, because that's a powerful resource to listen to your mentees. So I think, one of the key aspects which you notice fairly quickly is whether your mentor will listen and gives you a platform to speak and for you to be heard.
So this is a great, these are my fellow panelists are bringing up some excellent points here for sure. One of the things that I just wanted to sort of point out, particularly to majority group members, is just that there is a cost to getting it wrong in EDI, especially too, right? So when you make choices to make your lab more diverse or to embrace EDI, you really have to go all the way in, and you have to realize that you're going to make mistakes, that things are not going to go well. You need to practice apologizing, figuring out how to apologize, how to make amends meaningfully when it's necessary, and it will be necessary, and that's okay. I mean, part of this is, a journey that, we're all trying to go on, but thinking about like trying to improve representation within a lab, it's not enough to just say we need more people in the door. We need more people who look different from the people we have right now in the door. That's not going to help make them successful. That's not going to help make your lab successful. That's not going to help change the culture. And so I think it's really important to make sure that you take a really mindful approach to trying to make these changes, so that when you are able to sort of attract and retain trainees who deserve to be a part of your lab, who deserve excellent training and can be in an environment where they feel very supported and feel like people are willing to learn and grow and improve EDI generally. I also just wanted to touch on, there's a question that came up from the chat too about what to do if you want to talk about these things, but you feel like the lab might not be ready, or that the culture that you would want to be there isn't really in place yet. And I think that it goes, to what Olivia was saying too, that if you're part of the lab, you're part of the culture. One way to start with some of this stuff too, if you feel like you can't talk to your mentor about this, or you feel like this, might be a little resistant to change, or just haven't been paying attention or something like that, sometimes it can help to talk to your peers first. Talk to people who look like you, or people who don't look like you, maybe people who do look like your mentor, and start working your network however you can work it, right? So if that means talking with peers, sometimes talking with people who are in interim positions in the lab. So as a postdoc, I sort of sit in this awkward place between being a PI and being a trainee, but that means that I also I'm somebody who has a little bit more leadership in the lab, but I'm a little more approachable than your traditional sort of supervisor who might be too busy or too scary or any of those sorts of things too. So sometimes getting a person like that on board to move things forward. And I think one thing I would hope, and you never know, but if you feel like your lab culture isn't there yet because you haven't talked about those things, then in some ways bringing it up one-on-one with people, you might realize that people are farther along than you thought, or that there are other people who really do want to talk about this, but they didn't know that anybody else felt the same way, right? So I think it's really about having that first conversation and trying to figure out where you can go from there, and building on that and bringing in more people and building that coalition.
Just to touch on that, I literally knew, Olivia, you were going to press unmute. I was like, gotta be here. So I feel like you may say similar things. So just to touch on that, I do realize, and this is something I've learned throughout the last couple of years, is and it seems like all of the panelists are fortunate to be in quite forward-thinking labs that are very inclusive. I will say my lab is super inclusive, very forward-thinking. I always felt like I had a voice. I've always been someone who was able to kind of make my voice heard. I think just because I was always kind of the underrepresented person in almost every circle I was in for a really long time in my life. But I recognize that some labs are just not that inclusive of spaces. Sometimes it's really hard to have those discussions. So to the question, and I echo everything that Kasey said, but if you feel like having a full-blown EDI discussion may not be the right time right now, kind of try to think of ways to ease into it. There are a lot of kind of simple topics like, oh, hey, did you hear about this new paper that looked at the effects of racism in socioeconomic class? Did you read about that paper? And that's kind of a scientific paper that, people may start thinking about how what the science has to say, and then slowly kind of work your way into a place where the lab is ready for that. So sometimes you just got to massage the lab just a little bit, and then once they're ready, you feel like you can have that actual discussion. And I think that may be a promising approach, only because there are going to be some people that are just not comfortable if you drop the question out of nowhere and they don't know how to fully respond to that. But if you kind of give them a little bit of guidance, push them a little bit, and then when they're ready, have that, have these much more intense discussions. I think that could be a promising approach. If you are someone who also may not feel very comfortable in your lab environment to have a full-blown EDI discussion when some members are not ready for that.
Okay, this is my sign to unmute then. So there's a few things that Kasey kind of highlighted really nicely. One, she thought of a really unique way of using the resources that are available. So I want to highlight the fact that you can actually go outside of yourself. It's okay to say, I don't think I'm the right one to handle bringing EDI potentially into your lab space. So maybe I should consult an outside service. That's okay. But I like Kasey's point because she thought of a unique way to do it. Start thinking about hiring practices within your own lab, bringing in maybe a postdoc who can actually, in that trainee to PI phase, that can actually work on the mentorship side of things to maybe encourage and foster a better environment within your space that touches on that topic of EDI. And it's okay to bring in an outside source to maybe run a workshop because it's a chance for you to learn a bit too. And what I'm finding is that institutions now have these resources available. So for example, at Western, we have something like the BrainsCAN EDI committee that actually talks about integrating EDI in your research in these huge new things that are being added to grant proposals, such as your EDI action plans or statements. So it's those it's okay to say I'm not the expert in this, and it's okay to bring in an outside resource. It's fantastic if you can integrate it into your actual lab space by bringing in personnel that can help support this even more and your own learning. So I just wanted to really highlight that point.
I'll just add a quick thing to that, actually, in terms of bringing in people that can speak to their own experience and share that with the lab. So Blake, for example, recognized that he doesn't know much about being a woman in science because he's not a woman. So he invited Kasey. I think that was one of the first times we met, but he invited her to talk to our lab, and she talked about the different aspects, of being a woman in science and how equity, diversity, and inclusion would work in that setting where you have to consider childcare and a lot of different aspects, and that even though it's 2020, we're still not completely free of, societal norms and heteronormative, norms that are put on us. And that's also something that has transferred onto science and something we should be aware of. So exactly like you said, Olivia and Hajer, just bring in people who can speak to this and have experience. And even if your mentor isn't the person to invite someone to speak, you can always suggest that to your mentor. I mean, if there's no effort involved in them organizing anything, you know how to book a room, you know how to schedule that person to come talk to you. Now, it being on Zoom, it's even easier. So, in that case, if you say, I want to do this thing, I don't see a reason why they should say no if there's no effort involved. So, one tip.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all excellent points. One thing I would really want to impress upon people, though, too, is you should absolutely seek expertise if you don't have it and get it from somebody who does, but that doesn't absolve you from doing the work. That doesn't absolve you from making efforts to educate yourself. And you want to make sure that when you're engaging with this work too, you're not putting the pressure on people who are already overburdened to teach you things about themselves or things about their experience, right? It's one thing to invite somebody to come and share their experience, and it's an amazing opportunity to learn from them if they're available to do that. But also be prepared for people to say, no, I'm too busy. Here are some other resources that you can engage in with yourself, that you can read for yourself, or that you can learn about for yourself too. And I mean, I think that that's kind of, we can't just outsource this work and say, okay, we had a workshop one time for the lab, and so now, this EDI has been solved and we can move on and do other things. This is something that has to be a continuing and ongoing process too. Alex, you brought up the fact that I had given this presentation in your lab about women in science. I think it was like a year ago at this point too.
Yeah, it was a while ago, yeah.
Yeah, it was. And I was actually thinking about that presentation the other day, because as I was like thinking back and reflecting on it too, I was like, a lot of the way I had put it together was just mostly screenshots of people on Twitter complaining about and not complaining, but like justifiably venting about the experiences that lots of women have in science. And I realized that, a year ago, a lot of the people that I was following on Twitter were white women like myself. And so I think that that's the kind of thing, when I think back on that sort of, talk and presentation, that's something that I definitely would want to update and do again in the future. But I also realized that I need to expand the perspectives that I'm listening to. I need to expand the perspectives that I, have in my general environment, and that's something that I'm in control of. So, thinking about ways to educate yourself, there are tons and tons of resources available online now too. Lots of professional societies have EDI resources on websites. There are lots of books to read. There's sort of information overload where you can get this stuff, but also Twitter is an excellent place to find information, to hear voices of people that you don't have in your immediate environment and that you haven't had a chance to listen to before. So, encouraging, and academic Twitter, science Twitter is also very impressive. I feel like I learn lots and lots of things every day. And it's a really awesome place to be able to integrate both like neuroscience and research work and EDI at the same time.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think just to add, sorry, Olivia, I see you were going to go.
No, go for it.
Just a short note that one of the reasons why Kasey is mentioning the overburdening of, people in marginalized groups is because there is a lot of EDI work being done here. There's a big push. So there's a huge demand on these people's time. And that kind of follows the structure of what's happened before, is where we often see that marginalized people will spend more time doing, mentoring. They spend more time in their community and support roles, where that is now we're putting even more on that. So it's very important to be aware that this time is very valuable. So if you can, Kasey always asks the questions of what's the budget? How can we pay this person? How much can we do? If not, then gift certificates or anything else, but just to show that the time they give you is valuable, because that is also unfortunately a systemic problem where that time is commonly undervalued, and it's work that is done voluntarily pro bono, and we also need to change that. So that's usually Kasey's spiel, but I'm bringing it in too.
I love it. And just to add, I think, again, Kasey just bringing up those sexy topics. That's what I'm going to say right now. When we look at things like, especially now in a time when we're engaging online a lot, it's super important that as a mentor, even your connections and your communities that are even on a social and virtual level are diverse and come from different backgrounds and experiences, where you can see, like on Twitter, where everyone's sometimes are very actively engaged in describing experiences or sharing their research and what they're doing within their work and outside of it. It's super important to actually learn from that and engage with it in itself and ask a bit more, because I'm seeing a lot of responses to a tweet that is often asking the right questions to learn more, to help the individual better understand where that individual is coming from as well, either as a parent or from different backgrounds as well. Especially parenting during the era of Zoom is so hard. And then on top of that, the other point that I think Hajer brought it up a while ago about this mentality of thinking that these people don't exist, or you can't find them, or they're not interested in neuroscience or from underrepresented groups. It's because there are a lot of barriers to get there. And you have to keep that in mind. And it comes down to starting to actively recruit in these populations, or at least offering mentorship or ways that they can learn about the neuroscience work that you do, because it can be often uncharted territory, because it's something they haven't had the chance or even time to experience or money to experience, just because it's something that they're, like Alex touched on, they're spending a lot of time in their communities, or even supporting their own families, working full time. They don't even have the chance to start thinking about their academics and the potential doors that it opens as well. So thinking about that, and again, that comes down to increasing representation too. The more that an individual sees of themselves, they're more likely to start exploring that a bit more. And I love to talk about the schooling system in Canada. And when you're looking at high school, you often see that some of these underrepresented groups are already fizzled off and pushed into a category where they can't actually pursue an academic career in something like neuroscience, just because it's already been, they're deemed as someone who may not be in the gifted program, or may not be on the university side and should stay in the trades, etc. It's all these little different things that you may not even think start so far back that impacts an individual's ability to get into a lab environment or space. And I know I'm going a bit off topic, but space where they can be in something like the neurosci community.
One thing I really wanted to touch on, I think it's a really important work, is that we should also be bringing in researchers or academics at all levels to talk about the research that they do. So I feel like one thing that we often think about is like, we're going to have this one person from an underrepresented group give a presentation about being from an underrepresented group. And this gives the idea that we're only really good at our own life story, not at the actual work that we do. So when you are thinking of the people that you want to follow on Twitter, as Kasey so wonderfully mentioned, and kind of thinking about, are there biases? Like, am I only following people who look like me? It's not just about their perspective on EDI and their lived experience. It's the fact that there are scientists doing really good work. So when we think about the people that we want to bring into our lab meetings or, bring into keynote presentations, we shouldn't be looking at the one person in an underrepresented group to give a presentation on that. We should actually be giving them a space to share their research. And I think that is what really is going to elevate their career and help people see that anybody who looks in any certain way, who has any sort of different orientation than others, can do really good research. And the message to do that is to give them the platform to share their research, not just to share their life story. They both go hand in hand. You cannot remove one from the other. But I am starting to notice high emphasis of bringing underrepresented folks just to talk about their experience, and then bringing in, majority folks to actually talk about the research. And there needs to be there needs to be much more effort into balancing that out.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think that anyone, because I mean, the power and privilege hierarchy is vast and there are many different levels. So whatever level you have, you use it to push other people forward and ahead, and you give them a platform. But just like you said, Hajer, it's not about, just talk about your lived experience, because all we can see is the fact that your skin color is different, or that you have an accent, or that, you're maybe disabled, or you look different from the norm. It's so important to highlight that you're just making space for what these people do in their research, professionally, and whatever. And exactly, like, you're just making space and just helping others get more of the spotlight so that it's actually equal.
Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit, and our next two questions are sort of, what are equity, diversity, and inclusivity considerations when designing neuroscience and neuroimaging studies? And sort of paired with that, if you already have existing data, what sort of things should you be aware of in terms of sort of EDI considerations when you're going to analyze data?
So I do a lot of animal work, so it's kind of tough to touch on some of the areas of underrepresentation. Mostly I look at the impact of sex within the work I do, and that's extremely important for me, at least, especially because for the brain, a lot of the hormones impact kind of the various processes and mechanisms that occur, especially in some of the areas that I'm looking at, including neuroplasticity. But generally speaking, this is more of a general thought, and I hope other people are starting to think the same way. I'm seeing or reflecting on the fact that we have a lot of equations that equate in race, or, for example, the equation is slightly adjusted for those who are from this group. And I never quite understood the history of that. And I think it's something that everyone should start thinking about more critically when they're looking at ways that their data needs to be analyzed or need to be considered when equating a final output or outcome with whatever work you do, whether it's in brain imaging, et cetera, because maybe that actually came from an area of race study, which was unethical and actually makes really no difference in terms of the basic physiological background of the human and the human brain. So it's just the thought to start thinking about. I don't know if it's actually impacted anyone else's work here, because I'm the animal person, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in terms of at least the recruitment side of things and actual analysis of your work.
I guess, go for it.
No, go for it. Or are we doing the middle school?
We can do it. It's your turn now.
Are you sure?
Yeah, go for it.
I'll try not to be long. I really wanted to touch on the second question, and I think a lot of us, or I guess all of us actually, we really need to reconcile with the fact that, we don't give enough importance to the philosophical nature of science. So when we think about things like, I always hear scientists say, well, that's what the data says, but what is data? it's a philosophical question, you know, like how are we collecting data? What are we actually measuring? As Olivia mentioned, what is the history of what is being collected? So my favorite example, and many of you may have heard this, the IQ example. We all still use IQ in most human studies, but if you trace back, IQ really measures how good you are at an IQ test. And it was created by people within a certain community in time where it really favored one community over the other. So if you were to look at the data, one may say, in a very scientific sense, well, Black Americans actually do worse on the IQ test. Like, that's not me, that's just the data. But if we're not being very critical about every single tool that we're using and being critical of what we're actually measuring, what are the philosophical assumptions or the epistemology of that data, what is the history? Who created these measures? Are they from 1938? And, you know, in that time where racism science was quite normal? And if we're not really asking these questions, we're not able to put that all behind us. So not considering history and science, which a lot of scientists don't do, unfortunately, is really going to impede the future of science. And I think one of the important ways is to just understand all the measures that we're using, whether it is data that we are going to collect or whether it is data that we actually collected, and being very critical about all those steps. Is it easy? No, not at all. You know, if you, now everybody's going to say, but if you don't have IQ, then you're missing a covariate in your model, and then we can't really interpret the results and things like that. It is a hard process. But I think just, you know, for us scientists who are here, it seems to me that we're all forward thinking. And I think the best way to do that is to really be really critical about all the assumptions we're making every single time we're using any questionnaire. And the last point is the interpretation and how we frame our questions is really important. So we see this in a lot of studies. They'll say something like, you know, race influenced this, mediated this brain behavior relationship, and then it's used to justify something. And I don't think the scientists were necessarily ill-intentioned, but I think that may not be the most appropriate thing to say. What's more appropriate is to say that the long-term racism against this particular group may have made it so that they lived in an environment which was disadvantaged, and they did not have the possibility of, you know, having high measures of this particular test that we deem as so important. So it really is going to be breaking down the structures that we have, the structures of the data that we collect, the structure of how we create our questions, and the structure of how we interpret the results to make sure that they're actually consistent with what we know about epidemiology in whatever region that we're looking at. I meant to be a lot shorter, Alex. I do apologize.
Oh, no, that was excellent. You know, all the things you said are spot on totally. And I think that it's extremely important to question the questionnaires that you highlight, because IQ is a social construct. So anything that is a social construct has a history, has context within society, and we need to think about who it was designed for, by who, where it was used, just like you said. And I can bring this into my research on deaf adults, and looking at how they're already extremely marginalized because they don't participate in spoken language like we do. And so there is there's still a huge discussion when it comes to inclusivity there, because it's such a clear example of how there's a separation. And you say, well, should hearing people learn sign language to be more inclusive? Absolutely. Especially, in settings where you want to make sure that it's, the news, for example, are accessible to people who are hard of hearing or are deaf and use sign language. So you'll see someone sign the news, and that's an example of inclusivity. But that in turn needs to be implemented more and more throughout society in contexts where you want to be more welcoming. And furthermore, taking this into actual, research measures, if I want to measure someone's language proficiency, I'm not going to do this with spoken written language for a deaf individual, because they if they report so, use sign language more. So I should test their language proficiency in sign language. And there are tests for that. So it's just another example of how you need to think about what you actually want to test, whether your test is sensitive to the group, and go from there. And always keep questioning, is this right? Am I excluding someone by using these measures? And how can I be more inclusive in that?
So just to build on that point too, I mean, I feel like, one of the things we always have to keep in mind when we're collecting data too is that our results are only as generalizable as the sample that we collect. So I'm a primarily human researcher, and I know that, a lot of times there's sort of, a little bit of contention between human researchers and animal researchers at some point in time when you say, oh, we found this thing, and it's like, oh, okay, well, that's in mice. Or, oh, we have this new finding, oh, but it's in rodents, or oh, it's in something like that too. But we don't necessarily always take the time to think about our human samples to say like, oh, we found this thing, oh, but it's in like college undergraduates, who are, have whatever other things going on with them. So thinking about trying to recruit more diverse samples or community-based samples for the research that we do, I think is a very noble goal, and is something that we should all be working towards so that the results of our research is more generalizable. But I think that there's sort of a flip side of that coin too, that you can't just go to communities that have been historically excluded from research and expect that they will welcome you, and that they'll be, willing or active participants for you to come do something, especially if it feels like you're doing something on them instead of with them, sort of in collaboration. So I think that there's, to really effectively engage in community research, there needs to be a lot of time spent on sort of relationship building, and also, again, this sort of educational piece, this responsibility that we have to ourselves. I think Hajer brought up a great point about, the history of a lot of this stuff too. And if you think about, communities of color especially, and particularly research that has any kind of biomedical bent, there's a lot of distrust of the research community for extremely, extremely good reasons. There is a lot of historical mistreatment. There are really good resources to educate yourself about that if you're not familiar with any of those things too. And so I think that you have a responsibility before approaching these communities to be participants in your research project, to come with some of acknowledgement of that history, of understanding some of that background and why people might be hesitant to participate or concerned about participating, and then do the work to try to, convince them that it's worth it, and make sure that it is worth it for them too.
And just to
Go
build
for it, Olivia.
always us two, but just to build on that, again, it's really important to kind of start looking into the community leaders if you are trying to start targeting some or create a more inclusive research group, and as well as the participants you're actually trying to study, because hearing from them and ways to better approach those individuals from various communities may actually be super beneficial with how you recruit and how you get individuals involved in your work. They can even provide feedback as to maybe why that questionnaire didn't necessarily apply to them in the same ways as it may have applied normally in the past based off of the history. And I think that's such an extremely important aspect to include. I'm starting to notice it a lot more in working with Indigenous peoples. A lot of them are actually being engaged and brought into the conversation before people are just kind of walking in saying, hey, we're trying to study you, not bring you in with the study. So I think that's extremely important point.
To take it up one step further, I think what's also really important, and I loved everything that Olivia and Kasey just said, but it's to also have people from those communities as part of your research group. So this is where having a diverse team and doing good quality research that takes into consideration all these EDI concepts that we're mentioning go hand in hand, and it's really hard to disentangle them. If you have people, whether it is even a master's or PhD student or a collaborator from that group, it's going to create an automatic trust because that person knows how to communicate with their community. So I think I am still a little bit cautious of the idea that well-intentioned majority group researchers go into a community and, really try to say and build this relationship, and then to continue the research. I think there's nothing wrong with that, but I think to really take it up the notch, it is really important to have that synergy between the diversity that you want in your own group and the diversity that you want within the research participants, and have them go hand in hand.
Yeah, I'll just add a little thing to that. But I think that's extremely important to kind of show that I'm like you and I'm studying A, B, and C, and it's a safe, inclusive, diverse environment. And I think that I've had some experience because I've been studying deafness, and I've had a lot of deaf participants take various different experiments and stuff in my previous work and here as well at Western. And so it's extremely important, just like you guys said, to show that we're doing this together. We're going to keep in touch. First of all, you have to establish trust and say, I don't just want you to participate and then I'll just discard you because you don't. Like, you have to show value, and these are people. And, I still keep in touch with some of the participants that I scanned and so in York, in the UK. I have them on Facebook. They'll send some messages sometimes, and I will too. They're people, and what you're in the people business. Olivia, for now, it's mice, but maybe people later, who knows, right? But that's what it is. You just have to talk to someone person to person, show respect, show them that you are asking something of them, but that you're willing to give whatever you can back. You pay for their time, you send gift certificates if you can. If they have trouble getting to Western for an experiment, you make sure that you clear those barricades, and make sure that you are able to have them participate for a study, maybe not between 9 and 5 when people might be working and they can't make that time. So if you want to have diversity in your sample, you also need to go the extra mile and make sure that you are accommodating.
My last point, which is driven, were you going to unmute yourself, Olivia? I felt it. Really quick. My last point to this, and this is kind of largely stemming from the fact that I do a lot of bilingual science communication, mainly on Instagram in English and Arabic. And one thing that I'm always humbled by is the fact that science is such a English majority endeavor. Everything is in English, and a lot of people who live here, so there's a very large community of Syrian newcomers, for example. If there is someone who does not speak Arabic, they cannot target that population and bring them into, or that community, and bring them into our studies. So I think there's, it's a very multi-layered, complex situation, and I think we can just kind of take a bite at it each time. So it's not that we have to do everything perfectly all at once. We're trying to do this gradually, but there are a lot of considerations that we should kind of think about. If we really want to be as diverse as possible, it's really important that we bring in these communities where they may be a lot more central in the language that they originally speak, that is not English, and figure out how to communicate science with them, figure out how to bring them into our studies and have all these protocols or ethics statements translated in a way that would make sense to them. And so I think that's, and this is something I'm really passionate about, just because I haven't realized how English-centered science is until I started, working with the Arab community. Many of them are in the Middle East, and you just think, wow, there's a huge divide in the knowledge that is available to me and the knowledge that is available to you, and the research that I have access to and what I can learn and what you can learn. And that exists even in non-English speaking communities within North America or Europe.
I was going to transition I was going to transition to some mouse talk, but I was going to let Kasey or anyone else.
I wanted to bring up just something brief to what Alex said in terms of keeping in touch with research participants. Definitely look into your country's legal sort of legality around that, because I used to work in Sweden before I moved to Canada. And in Sweden, I had to sign a piece of paper that basically said that I could not contact or communicate or mention if I ran into a research participant outside of the context of research that they had participated in research with me. So if I ran into them in the grocery store or the city center and I brought up that, oh, hey, how did the research scan go? I was legally liable for that and could be sued monetarily, and that I had no backup for that. So just be careful.
So that's almost like a relationship with a therapist where they don't acknowledge you unless you acknowledge them or something like that.
Yeah, no, there were famous stories in Sweden. There was a physician who had been long retired and was up in a cabin and ran into a former patient, and they hadn't had a physician-patient relationship in like 30 years. And he just casually asked, you know, how the patient's health was. The patient viewed this as a
infringement on
like an invasion of his privacy, and sued the physician for like millions of kroner.
Yeah.
So, you know, just sort of be careful about, you know, potentially blurring those lines, and make sure that it's okay for you to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I guess I should look into that. But in terms of, you know, communication, and so it was always initially initiated by participants who would add me on Facebook, and I would ask my supervisor and other collaborator who also had a relationship with them, saying, is this okay? But definitely look into it, because we don't want anyone to get into any trouble. You can get sued for lots of crowns.
No,
go ahead. I'm going to say one more human thing, and then it's onto mice. I know that Kasey's also worked closely with Laura at BrainsCAN, who is responsible for the participant pool that Western has, which is called Our BrainsCAN online, and anyone can register. So I know that, you know, there are a lot of different discussions surrounding how can we have a diverse group of people register to make sure that, you know, the participants that we have resemble the demographic of Canada. So it's not predominantly just white or just English speaking, etc., etc.
I just wanted, oh, no, Olivia, I saw you unmute yourself. You go, girl.
I'm trying to let the human talk go as long as possible, so keep it going, because I want to make sure that those rodent thinkers or other animal models can also understand relationships as well.
I just wanted to touch on, there was a comment here that says cultural differences, and it reminds me of this really interesting discussion that is happening in a lot of Hollywood spaces, where they're talking about the fact that they need this Jamal the intern, where, you know, a lot of people are writing these movies about underrepresented groups, but the people that are writing the movie, they're not from underrepresented groups. And in many ways, a lot of this still exists in science. So there's this really funny story of someone in my lab who had an experience where they were doing an EEG experiment. And someone came in wearing a headscarf, and he was male. And so he just did not get that, like, she would not take off her headscarf. And he was just like, so she said, oh, you're going to put something on my head, like on my scarf? And he was like, no, you're going to take the scarf off, obviously. And it just kind of, he just wasn't aware of the situation. And there was nobody there to explain, like, when we are designing EEG experiments, for example, how are we going to take that into consideration? And it may not just be the headscarf. There may be people, other women, who only want a woman to put on their EEG, or vice versa. So it really depends on the comfort level. But having people with those cultural differences or religious differences or orientation differences to really guide how we want to kind of put together the research protocol is really important, so we don't run into these little you know, situations where it increases the tension that already exists. Because as you can imagine, for that woman, it obviously feels like a very exclusive environment if she thinks that somehow there's going to be, you know, they're going to take into consideration what she needs, but nobody does because they didn't know about it. So I just wanted to touch on that since there was a comment on cultural differences.
There's also another angle to the cultural differences in terms of relationships, even with research participants outside of the research itself. Again, some participants, if they're the ones to initiate conversation, don't even understand that these dynamics do exist, and it is fairly complicated. So just naturally, just friendly, and based off of wherever their cultural background is, they may interact differently. And even in the work you do yourself in research, they may interact differently as well. And it's something to be considerate and aware of. So sometimes eye contact isn't very common, or sometimes physical interaction, although that's not really much a thing anymore with COVID, is different. So it's just all those things to keep in mind in that other angle of cultural differences as well. So I thought that was an interesting point. And then, yes, for all my, oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in and say one tiny thing to Hajer's point. I'm so sorry, Olivia. Can you request a female MRI tech? So just consider that if you do MRI research and you have participants who wear headscarves or have sort of cultural considerations where they might prefer a female tech to get them into the scanner to, do things where they have to interact with or without their scarf on too, is that something that's possible at your institution? So at least something to think about. It is possible at CFMM at Western. There you have to make arrangements ahead of time, but you definitely can do it. I've done it before. So just keep that in mind.
I really love that. And I love there's so many so many intricacies in this, but once you start thinking about it, considering it, and doing it that first time around, it's honestly just going to become easier and a part of the systems and practices done at your institution. Hence why at Western, we have those capabilities of bringing in a female MRI tech. So that's so important. And for those who don't work with humans and are working with other models to understand even just basic mechanisms or disease models of the brain, it's important to start considering sex. I still see a lot of research that only include male mice, at least from my angle, just because it's honestly sometimes easier. When you start considering sex hormones in the work that you do, it can actually complicate it a lot. But it's also important to think about, because why are we seeing these differences? Why might it be implicated in the work you do? And does that actually maybe can be considered in the human model, for example, or in humans? So I think that's important. In my work, I always use both. It does double the time in the research I do, mainly because I need to run another cohort. In order to see differences by sex, I need to up that N. So it's important to have. And then sometimes you may not see differences, and that's also an answer in itself. Maybe the basic biological mechanisms that we're thinking of behind the neuroscience work we do doesn't really differ when we start considering sex hormones or the physiology of a female mouse body, for example. Again, doesn't always translate into humans, but it's still important to consider. And I just wanted to really emphasize that in terms of the work you do. And you're seeing it in a lot of the grant applications here in Canada, when you, or even scholarship applications. So that's the process I'm in, applying to CIHR. I have to talk about either sex or gender and if they're being considered.
Yeah, I think that's crucial, like just making sure that your sample is balanced, because there are so many, and I am going to diverged into medical research from neuroscience, but it's all related. Even the fact that in our society, when we're taught about the symptoms of having a heart attack, the ones that we all know, and I'm sure we could all recite, are actually based on studies on men. So do women experience symptoms of a heart attack the same way? No, they don't. But I would have to search for it again now, because I can't remember, because that's how ingrained it is, and that's how biased the research is, and then the information that gets translated into society, and that's what we need to shift massively. Another example, because I'm going further away from neuroscience, but they're very powerful examples, is looking at crash testing cars and the fact that the dummies that are being used are male-sized. So, if you're considering a woman or even, a teenager or a pregnant woman, like all of these factors need to be considered when you're looking at a car and how safe it is. It can't just be mostly safe for one individual being male, and then the rest can kind of try and fit into that model, and good luck. So that's why when it comes to diversity and inclusion in our samples, it's extremely important to think about because it does impact our society and how we see things, how we fix things, and rehabilitate, basically. So.
I guess we have one last question, which is much more of a practical one, just because I think a number of the panelists have sort of, mentioned these sections, but it seems like a growing number of Canadian research funders are starting to require sort of EDI statements and EDI sections in their grants. And I know the BrainsCAN Western EDI committee has been doing some work on trying to help the researchers at Western sort of tackle these sections, particularly if it's their first time. But I guess for the audience here who may be at various points in their career and needing to stare down this section, what are some tips for writing an effective one?
So I'll get us started this time, out of order. I think, yeah, depending on the level that you're at right now in your career, there are different levels at which you can affect EDI in your lab. So as a graduate student, like Olivia said, you can still inject conversation, discussion, and talk about different aspects. So when you're writing, I'm guessing that as a graduate, as a postdoc, you'll be writing a statement rather than an action plan because you don't have your lab yet. However, you can always make sure, firstly, to highlight and acknowledge the fact that there is still an issue in research today, that there is systemic racism, unfortunately. So the first thing to always do is to acknowledge it, to show that you understand, that you see it, that you know that this needs to be corrected, and that brings you into, another section where you can discuss what you do and what you can, how you can improve EDI in your environment. If you have some, involvements, definitely mention that. Just to show that you're invested in this and that you realize that it's important to inject it into the conversation, and that in turn shifts the culture. So just speaking about it, talking about it, doing different things will make a change.
Yeah, to add, one of the things that some people might fall into the trap of when writing these statements is clearly defining the demographics of their group and providing percentages. And it's just like, oh, you don't want to just reveal the inside scoop of everyone in your lab. You have to be considerate of them. And it doesn't really say much. It says, I mean, it's great that you do have a diverse lab group, but the fact that you have to definitively state that sometimes rubs me personally the wrong way. And I don't know if it's the same with whoever's reviewing it. It's like, okay, you don't need to justify all of this. We get that that's a part of your systems, but tell me, what are you actually doing? How is it practical? And what is the actual impact of all that? Some other things to keep in mind is don't talk about the literature and EDI just generally. Give examples that are specific to your lab environment and research group and project itself, right? So that's super important, and making sure that things can be tracked and accountable. So one thing that is lacking in EDI work and in the research environment is, where the heck's the data? How are we supposed to measure the improvement? How are we supposed to actually see that there's been change implemented in all the stuff that's been done in the past? You do have to track it. You do have to keep it somewhere so that you can see, my research is so much more enriched because we now have all of this data and information available to us. So that's something to keep in mind. And if it's already something you're doing in your work, include that in your statement, in your action plan, etc.
To piggyback off of that point, love everything you both said. I just want to acknowledge that I have not actually written an EDI section for a funder. I presume that, similar to what we mentioned before, if we consider EDI as integral to our research as the statistical analysis plan, I think the way that we think about it in many ways has a lot of parallels. So, what would we do normally when we're putting a grant together? We're highlighting that, this has been found, but here's a gap. Here's how I want to fill that gap. And in many ways, in the EDI context, it's that the gap is that we've never had this type of research before. And here are the possible implications of that. And this is why I think recruiting, from these populations and these communities can give us a holistic understanding of brain and behavior differences within this particular area in Ontario, for example. So I think really thinking about it first as integral as any other part of the research plan, as opposed to like this thing that people are making you write, so you have to write it. And then kind of walking them through all the steps of why this is important for your research study, and not just that, what are you going to do so that you can make sure that your research is as equitable. And I love Olivia's point, having some sort of quantifiable metric as we normally do. Normally in a grant or an award, you would say like, here's my aims hypothesis, this is the analysis plan, these are some of the expected results, this is the kind of significance of what's going to happen for my research. And in the same way, we should think about these letters just like that. In a way that is humanizing, though. I do want to say that it isn't just about numbers. Part of the story is that we want to bring people and call people into the scientific research community. So I do want to mention that as well.
Yeah, I definitely think that these EDI statements, I feel like one of the crucial things about them is to really be genuine in your thoughts and feelings about this, and sort of, and then being honest about where you are, in your EDI journey, about the experiences you have or haven't had or are interested in seeking in the future, and really sort of acknowledging that. Like Alex makes a great point too. Acknowledging is huge. To Olivia's point too, it's not helpful to engage in what, from a social psychology perspective, is really considered moral licensing, right? Oh, I can't be racist because I have Black students in my lab. Oh, I can't be sexist because half my trainees are women. Like those, I feel like, especially in this day and age, those kinds of statements really, really fall flat, and they come across as being very disingenuous. So it's much better to sort of shift the focus on, acknowledging where you are, making it clear that you understand some of the issues, and then you're taking steps to sort of work towards them. And that's whatever stage you're at. Like, I think that that's also, really important to remember that, whether you're a student or a postdoc or, a PI or anything like that, everybody has a sphere of influence. Everybody has, the ability to make improvements in the sphere of influence that they have too. And so I think that the biggest thing with these statements is just making it clear that you are interested in making a difference and making things better, and that you're motivated to do that, and you have some ideas of how you might go about doing those things, and you plan to do that in the future. And then if you really want it to be effective, do what Olivia says and collect that data. Nothing's going to speak louder than having that data to be able to say, we came, we saw, we made it better.
And really to just beef up that the genuine component of your EDI plan and statement is to make sure that you know what you're talking about. In a sense, you're using the correct language, you're referring to things properly. So sometimes you see a lot of different uses of how Indigenous peoples are described. Is that accurate? Is that right? First Nations is different from Mentee, from other, from Aboriginal, etc. And language has evolved and changed from a lot of these terms too. So making sure that you're understanding all of that history and what the final ways you word that and present it are considered. And it's not always about hitting notes on, okay, I'm following human rights practices, I'm following the equity rules and laws that are provided by the university, et cetera, et cetera. Like, that doesn't really mean that's what you're doing in your own work. So I just wanted to highlight that.
I also just wanted to say quickly too, I mean, I know that I mentioned earlier that there is a cost to getting this stuff wrong, and that is 100% true. But that it also means to, like, there's, you have to be willing to sort of put yourself out there a little bit to get feedback, to really grow on a lot of that stuff too. So I feel like I make myself available to like basically all of my colleagues. I'm always happy to read an EDI statement. I'm always happy to sort of look it over. I'm always happy to offer, whatever lens that I can have on the things that they're writing to basically say, hey, when I read through this, like there's something that doesn't quite feel right about the way that you're saying this. Maybe you want to try saying it like this instead too. I think you're trying to touch on this point, but maybe you're not quite hitting it right. And I think that that's kind of one of those things with the more we can really engage in these discussions and bring other people in. Sometimes that engaging at that discussion is, hey, I'm writing this EDI statement for this grant. I'm stuck on this one part, or, hey, I think this EDI statement is really good. Can you give it a look over? Is there anything else that you think I should add it here? Or let's have a conversation about that too. So, back to the point of the person earlier who said, what if we want to talk about EDI in the lab, but we're not really there yet? Well, peer reviewing these EDI statements, for the other members of the lab, offering that, showing them your EDI statement, all of that kind of stuff is another great way that you can kind of bring up that conversation and really get the ball rolling on that too. Because nobody wants to be behind the times. Nobody wants to be sort of archaic and a relic of the way that things used to be or whatever too. So, we can really help sort of update each other and update our thinking on a lot of these things to move it all forward.
So I guess we've sort of reached the end of our questions. So if there are questions from the audience, now would be a good time to put them in the chat box. Unfortunately, we're sort of at the max number of people we can have up on Crowdcast, so we can't invite people up easily unless one of our panelists or me go away. So
Just to chime in, I can also try to kick myself out, I think.
But then we don't have a host. So.
It's true. I don't know how to kick myself out, but I'm trying.
If there are no additional questions, I guess we will thank the panelists for their time, and we'll close out this EDI panel discussion for Brainhack Ontario. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks.
Wow, we went for a solid hour and a half. Wow, we have so much to talk about.
Yeah.
I love this guy. So much fun.
Yeah.
It was a pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you all
Yes.
so much.
Mhm.
This was such a wonderful discussion. I learned a lot from it, so I'm really excited.
Cool. If anybody wants to join on our social media channels, I feel like I'm repeating myself every day, but you can. We have GatherTown and Discord, super fun places to chat if you want to discuss this in a more small, less open space.
I think we're also all on Twitter, so feel free to
Yeah.
like message us on there or even email us if you're ever going through the process of working on EDI work. We're always here to help, or at least because again, this work is extensive and it can be time consuming, we might be able to point you in the right direction to help you wherever you are. So exactly.
Definitely.
Cool. Yeah, so we'll be back definitely by 1:30 or 2 on the stream to watch potentially some videos and do some learning. And we also have a guest speaker, Sebastian Erk, who's going to tell us about Plotly, very different changes to fate, but cool visualizations. And then come back at 4 for wrap up, where we're going to talk about what was going on off screen, all the cool projects and how they were coming. So thank you guys for joining us. I will end the stream.
Should we take a photo? Or is that a thing that people do? A photo?
I secretly already took one because I'm like, damn, we
I had a
really
feeling.
good on the
It's like
screen.
Olivia would be the one person that would.
It went up on Twitter. I'm gonna take another one. I like all
Did we
6 of us.
smile?
Okay, ready?
We have to like pretend like we're together.
Yeah. Arms over, Karen. 3, 2, 1. Oh, you can even hear that beautiful.
Sorry,
sound.
do I look at the screen or the camera?
Oh,
Let's see. I don't-
look directly at the camera.
Okay.
Everyone looks good, so I'm happy with this.
Everybody look at the camera.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Okay, I'm gonna end the
Bye.
broadcast now.
Bye, everyone.